Hi everybody, my name's Sarah Rogerson. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honor. I spent 7 years living in Taiwan, so I'm especially excited to be here today talking to you all about assessment for learning. My focus today is to describe to you how an assessment for learning approach in any curriculum reform project or educational reform project can improve learning outcomes and motivation. And obviously any assessment for learning approach would need to be completely tied to any new framework of reference that Taiwan wants to design around the English language learning. Just going to check that I can move on. Okay, so I wanted to start by just having a quick step back and look at two different examples of assessment. And I think this is really important because assessment is a broad word and it means many different things to different people. The first version I'm going to look at is on the left there, which says the word assess means to sit beside. Literally then to assess means to sit beside the learner. And I've added an image there that shows a kind of assessment where the teacher is fully with the students in the classroom. And then the second version of assessment that I've got, so I'm just moving things away, is that assessment is a collection of relevant information that may be relied on for making decisions, which is equally true in the first, but it's just a bit more of a formal, definition of assessment. And I've added a picture there of students kind of sat at the desk doing the traditional pen and paper type test. And I want us to consider whether, as part of a reform project, you want to think of assessment as doing with somebody or doing to somebody. And I'm going to propose that we want to view assessment as something that you want to do with the learners, something you want the learners to be fully engaged in, and something that you want learners to be an active participant in driving their own learning forwards. So I'm considering assessment for learning for you as really a bridge to the future. Nick mentioned in his talk some of the negative washback associated with assessment, and some of that negative washback where you've got a single summative exam after a long period of time is around the pass-fail exam, around test anxiety, around students having to cram, around this system of rote learning, and a very demotivating experience for young people and adults. And what I would like us to consider is how assessment for learning, how assessment for learning can really drive learning forwards in creating lifelong learners, in creating motivated students, students who have the global skills needed to prepare them for the future, a future citizens of Taiwan who are really prepared to take part in any global community and any changing and unstable worlds that they may find themselves in. So assessment for learning I'm really considering here as a bridge to the future for you as part of this reform project. So assessment for learning is part of everyday practice by students, teachers and peers that seeks, reflects upon and responds to information from dialogue, demonstration and observation in ways that enhance ongoing learning. Assessment for learning fundamentally aims to answer the three questions that you can see on screen before you. Where am I? Where am I going? And how do I get there? By knowing the answer to the first question, where am I, students are fully engaged in understanding their exact strengths and weaknesses at a period of time. By answering the second question, your students are then saying, well, this is where I want to be, and where I want to be is obviously is probably a level within a CFR or a granular level within the CFR. And how do I get there? That's the students understanding how to travel from A to B, and how they get there is really through excellent teaching, feedback, and the ability to be an integrated member of the classroom. So if we think of assessment for learning as being a process that enables students to answer the following three questions: where am I going, and how do I get there? And that's a loop. They keep asking those questions again and again in order to advance their learning outcomes. So I'm considering assessment for learning for you with this diagram as a curriculum-aligned approach. Excuse me. The answer to the first question, where am I, comes from the learning objectives derived from the CFR or the CFR Taiwan or whatever framework or curriculum, whatever framework that you decide to have in place. The answer to the where am I sits within that framework. The answer to the where do I want to be also sits within that framework. It's making explicit to students and teachers where they are and where they want to get to. And then the answer to the and how do I get there comes from the rest. So the answer to how do I get there comes from learning objectives that are derived from the CFR that are embedded in course content. So the first box that you're looking at there is talking about course content having embedded assessment for learning features, resources, and intervention paths. What I mean by intervention paths is as a student takes part in their course, rather than just being told, no, that's wrong, or yes, that's right, they're directed down personalized or semi-personalized intervention paths that allows them to continually stay on top of their learning goals. In terms of the second box there, this is a standardized assessment offer. It doesn't have to be the traditional pen and paper type offer that we've discussed, but I think what's important in this kind of approach is that we see assessment as having different purposes. The assessment has to be the right assessment for the right time. So you might want to start with some kind of entry assessment which enables teachers to make sure that students are streamed into the right levels, if that's appropriate for your system. You might want to have a diagnostic type assessment where students are taking a kind of assessment that allows teachers and students to get feedback that explains specifically where the students' strengths and weaknesses are, so that the teacher can focus their energy on maybe plugging some of those weaknesses and supporting students in stretching themselves even more where the strengths lie. In a standardized assessment offer, you might want to have regular progress check-ins, again, that kind of tests that are collecting data on student performance so that intervention can take place. And then there's probably going to be an end-of-year assessment as part of any curriculum and any school system. And then all of this needs to be supported by solid teacher training, and some teacher training examples I've put here are assessment literacy, assessment for learning principles, and principles in how to give good feedback, because any assessment for learning approach needs to be underpinned by excellent feedback and intervention. Every point in this diagram that you see before you needs to be a way of collecting data on student performance in order to intervene. And I really see the assessment offer that I've described here as being a way for teachers to intervene on student performance so that no student really gets left behind. So that is an assessment for learning curriculum aligned approach where everything is linked to a central framework, possibly a version of the CFR of Taiwan or possibly a different framework, but everything needs to be underpinned, tied to a separate framework that allows the learning and assessment to be really brought together in the ways that Nick described previously. And again, just to recap, the three questions we're trying to answer for students and teachers are: where am I, where do I want to go, and how do I get there? I think they're three really good questions for life in general. So I want to quickly describe 5 key messages on assessment for learning. The first one is that in assessment for learning, teachers guide learners towards their goals. Teachers maybe aren't dictating what the goals are, but they're working with the learners and helping support them in achieving their goals. So they're guiding them towards their goals. Assessment for learning can be for learners of all ages and all levels. Assessment for learning truly moves the learning forwards. We don't want people to stay stuck at any one moment in time. So we're continually focused on moving learning forwards. It results in better outcomes and achievement. And it encourages positive attitudes towards lifelong learning. So there are 5 key messages on assessment for learning. And if you want to find out more about any of those messages and unpack them a bit more, I've added a paper in a slide at the end, which is where these messages derive from. But it's really drilling into assessment for learning, and it's an expert panel paper. on what assessment for learning is and how it drives learning forwards in the classroom. So there are numerous stated impacts around the positivity of assessment for learning. I wanted to talk about some of those here. So some of the stated impacts are around student achievement. There are a number of bodies of research that shows that assessment for learning increases student achievement. Second stated impact is around formative assessments like the kind that I've described, improving performance on summative assessments, so those high-stakes tests that students may have to take. The formative assessment is supporting improvement in those areas. I'd also like to add a comment from the Assessment Reform Group in 2002 that highlights assessment that promotes learning is the most powerful tool for raising standards and empowering lifelong learning, which I'm sure is something that this educational reform that you're considering is all about. In terms of student behaviour, assessment for learning has been proved to create more active participants with increased confidence and motivation. And it also supports improved metacognition, which enables independent learning. And for the teacher, we've done some research and explored teachers using the assessment for learning approach. And we discovered that successful teachers whose students received the top results did not focus on drilling and cramming. So that kind of rote learning that we looked at the beginning, that was derived from the negative washbacks. Well, we're noticing that teachers whose students do receive the top results don't focus on the drilling and cramming that we described before. And we're also talking about teachers as being active participants in this feedback loop, and teachers really needing to get feedback from students on the quality of their teaching and how to improve it. And we see this as being a key part of assessment for learning as well, that the classroom is really a two-way process, and that teachers can understand from students how best to improve their own practice. And the best teachers do act on feedback from students. So these stated impacts that I've described here have meant that many countries have adopted fully or partially adopted an assessment for learning approach in their educational reforms, and you can see this in New Zealand, Australia, an upcoming curriculum reform in Spain, in Canada. There are multiple countries where an assessment for learning approach is being implemented or has been implemented. It's not without problems, because like any approach, it's reliant on multiple stakeholders. It's, as Neo said, it's reliant on all teachers, it's reliant on policymakers, and it's reliant on parent buy-in as well. But the impacts are really, really positive, and I would advise people to consider this approach when designing any reform project. So in terms of possible quick wins, things that you could do within the next year in order to support an assessment for learning approach in the English classroom. There's a big thing about teacher training. It's not all teacher training, and it's dangerous to think it is all teacher training, but that's something that is something you could handle within a year. You could support your teachers in assessment literacy. You could support teachers in the principles of assessment for learning, in training how to give good feedback, and also training on how to improve learner agency in the assessment for learning classroom. And I've added in the reading list as well a paper on improving learner agency, because this is a really critical part to creating those lifelong learners. So this teacher training, which you could implement probably within a year, could set the seeds for future reform. It could start creating those teachers now that are contemplating how to give good feedback that support the principles of assessment for learning, and it could start supporting improved learning outcomes earlier. You'd obviously want learning objectives aligned to a curriculum. I understand that there's a curriculum already that exists. Maybe it's not the 4 skills curriculum at the moment, but as a short-term quick win, you could look at what learning objectives exist within that curriculum, and then provide clear examples of what good looks like, because the crucial thing about an assessment for learning approach is that teachers and students understand what you're expecting of them. They understand what the different levels of whatever framework you use are. So if that's the CFR, it's really important that your students and teachers know what mid A2 looks like, for example, and so that they then know what you expect them to achieve. So I thought it'd be useful to put these kind of quick wins in, because I think they are things that would possibly be achievable within a year. So just to reiterate, that would be teacher training, designing learning objectives around the curriculum, and providing clear examples to teachers and students of what your expectations are of the individual levels within any framework that you intend to use. I wanted to end there with a final quote from the OUP position paper, and that is that an ever-changing world needs learners who can think for themselves and cope with the unfamiliar. And I think now more than ever this is true. By helping students engage with learning, evaluate their progress, and respond to feedback, Assessment for Learning encourages this kind of active, flexible learning. So I had 15 minutes to speak. I think I've stayed within that 15 minutes. I can't see my clock, but I'd be delighted to discuss any of these points at any time. And in the meanwhile, within this slide deck, I've also attached a number of reports that look into Assessment for Learning in more detail and describe some of its benefits. So I'm going to hand back to Ralph now and thank everybody for their attention. Thank you.